Hello, and welcome to the Trails Breakout Session for DCNR's 2026 Community Conservation Partnership Program. My name is Alex MacDonald, and I'm the Section Chief of the Trails, Greenways, and Statewide Planning Section in DCNR's Bureau of Recreation and Conservation. I'm one of 5 staff members within this section. The 4 other members of the Trails section are Leslie Sarvis, Kristen Ziegler, Stephanie Dressler, and Brandon Hoover. During this year's Trails Breakout Session, we will start by reviewing the criteria for being considered a trail project under our grant program. After that, we will go through the general evolution of trail projects from concept to trail construction, discuss how our grants fit into those phases, and highlight common application issues. Then we will take a moment to highlight motorized recreation projects, discuss accessibility, and lastly, we will review the various funding sources available for trail projects. In recent years, DCNR has been able to fund approximately 70% of the trail applications received annually. So if you submit an application for a ready-to-go trail project, you have a pretty good chance of being funded. Generally, there is a $500,000 soft cap on trail grant awards. On occasion, we have awarded grants above the soft cap. However, you should approach your grant application with that $500,000 cap in mind, even if you must break your project into smaller phases. Your DCNR regional advisor will provide further guidance on your grant request amount after reviewing your budget and your unique project needs. Before you apply, it's important to know whether your trail project is considered a trail project under our grant program. If your project involves a designated route on land with public access for recreation and/or alternative transportation opportunities, then you have a trail project. However, if your project is an internal walkway confined within a park boundary, this is a parks project and should be submitted as a community parks project, not as a trail project. The next indicator to determine if your project is a trails project is to look at the budget. Does the budget have at least 75% of its costs allocated towards trails or trail-related facilities? Looking at the budget example here on the left, the majority of costs are trails-related. So this would be a trails project meeting the 75% threshold. Furthermore, for planning projects, if you are doing a study to determine the feasibility of building a trail on a specific corridor, close a gap within an existing trail system, or establish a trail network plan throughout your community, this is a trail planning project. However, if you are doing a community-wide parks, recreation, and open space plan with a trails component, this is a community recreation and conservation planning project and should apply under that grant opportunity. For trail acquisition projects, generally, those projects will be focused on acquiring trail corridors or trail facilities like trailheads. If your project involves acquiring a large block of land that has the potential for trail development, we would not consider that a trail project. Rather, you should apply under the Land Acquisition and Conservation Grant opportunity. DCNR's regional advisors are available to help you determine what type of grant application you have and help you get your application submitted under the proper grant opportunity. At the end of this presentation, there will be a map with contact information for each of the regional advisors. The trail development process. This diagram shows the typical process for establishing a trail. From the idea or concept phase to planning, where we typically analyze and assess the feasibility of a trail, to the acquisition of right-of-way, to engineering and design, and then finally to construction and development. Of course, let's not forget about maintenance. Now let's talk about how our grant program can help in each of these stages. Let's start with trail planning, which is typically the first step after concept. Trail planning projects follow a public process to examine the feasibility of developing land trails or trail-related facilities for motorized and non-motorized recreational activities. and they lay out an implementation plan to successfully move trail projects forward. How do you know if you should apply for a trail planning project? You should apply if you don't already have a plan for your trail. Most situations require planning in order to move successfully from concept to implementation. You should apply if you need to determine the feasibility of a trail, meaning can it legally be constructed and is there an organization with capacity to build and maintain the trail long term? Also, if you need to determine an alignment and acquire property, or if you want to establish a trail network throughout your community or region. Finally, if your trail alignment is already established and the property is controlled by the applicant, you can apply for design and engineering. Now we'll discuss the types of trail planning projects that we typically fund. Generally, we refer to most planning efforts as trail studies. These involve some element of feasibility, public participation, conceptual designs, and the establishment of implementation strategies. Also, we have trail network studies, which try to determine the feasibility of a trail network throughout a municipality, county, or region. Finally, we offer design-only grants. Design-only includes design and engineering work for projects that do not yet have construction funding secured. We should note here that DCNR requires a pre-approval before applying for a design-only project. This process begins by contacting your regional advisor. DCNR does understand that not all planning projects fit neatly into a standard template, which is why we try to provide flexibility in the scope of work for each planning effort. It's important to contact your regional advisor to discuss your project needs and how to best capture those in a planning scope of work. Common issues with trail planning applications. Lack of community or municipal support. This could mean the application is missing letters of support from those who have a stake in the outcome of the study. Also, a lack of detail in that scope of work and budget. You should have a detailed scope of work and budget that identifies the topic areas or tasks that will be covered in a study and costs associated with each of those individual items. There are scope of work items missing. For example, if you require a title of ownership research as part of your plan, then it should be in the scope of work as its own item and have a cost associated with it. Selecting a consultant prior to grant award. If a project is funded by DCNR, our policy requires an RFP process to secure a consultant. Consultants who give estimates during the application stage can also submit proposals to complete the work after a grant has been awarded. But typically, a consultant should not be chosen before a grant is awarded. Lastly, not reviewing a scope of work with your regional advisor. They can help you ensure your project scope of work is appropriate to your project. These are the common issues that we see in trail planning applications. The next step in the trail development process is often the acquisition of right-of-way. Trail acquisition projects involve the purchase of fee simple title or perpetual easement to real property for subsequent development of motorized or non-motorized trails and trail-related facilities. How do you know if you should apply for a trail acquisition project? You should apply if you have an identified corridor and a willing seller, or if your organization is prepared to develop the property for trail use, and that organization is also willing to own and manage the trail in perpetuity. Here are some things to consider before applying for a trail acquisition project. If you purchase property with DCNR funds, that commitment is in perpetuity. Also, a DCNR covenant must be placed in the recorded deed or easement stating that these properties cannot be converted to purposes other than those the property was originally acquired for, which means no change of use, no transfer of ownership, control, or interest in the property may occur, and that no encumbrances may be placed on the property without the written consent of DCNR. If there are structures on the property to be acquired, they may not be eligible as part of the DCNR purchase, or if the structure is considered eligible, it may be subject to the DCNR covenant. Finally, DCNR does not fund condemnation by eminent domain. If this is your situation, discuss with your regional advisor to review alternatives that might be acceptable to DCNR. Here are a few common issues we see with trail acquisition applications. First, the appraisal does not meet DCNR standards or is missing. A full appraisal report must be completed by a licensed general real estate appraiser and uploaded with your application. Occasionally, the appraisal does not meet these guidelines, or the applicant did not order the appraisal early enough and therefore could not upload it with the application. Also, lack of detailed description of negotiations with the landowner. This could mean the owner has not been contacted yet or has not yet agreed to sell the property. Finally, a budget is missing or has underestimated the associated cost with securing the property. For example, meets and bounds survey costs, title insurance, and a second appraisal. The last step in the trail development process is the actual trail development or construction. These are the projects that account for the bulk of trail applications. Trail development projects construct new and rehabilitate existing land trails and trail-related facilities for motorized and non-motorized recreational activities. How do you know if you should apply for a trail development grant? You should apply if you need to construct new miles of trails or trail facilities, or if you need to rehabilitate existing trails or trail facilities. If you are trying to close priority trail gaps, or you'd like to enhance access to or the accessibility of existing trails, trail systems, or trail facilities. Things to consider before applying for a trail development grant. Does your organization have ownership or control over the property to be developed? In some cases, DCNR can accept signed agreements between the owner and the grant applicant, but generally, we require that the applicant is the owner or has some type of control over the property. Second, are you prepared to follow the appropriate accessibility standards, and are those factored into the budget and scope of work? Lastly, is there demonstrated support for this project from the community and the local governments? Here are a few common issues we see with trail development applications. First is not having ownership or control at the time of application, or that the application fails to clearly explain that ownership and control is already secured. Also, not having match secured. Lack of consistency between the budget, site plan, and scope of work. For example, if the scope says ADA parking will be provided, does the budget reflect those costs, and is it illustrated in the drawing? Finally, the project is not considering the appropriate accessibility standards, which can impact the project budget. Finally, we offer trail equipment purchase projects. These include the purchase or lease of equipment for maintenance or construction of motorized and non-motorized trails. Trail equipment purchases can only be funded with two of our funding sources, the Pennsylvania Recreational Trails Program and the ATV and Snowmobile Management Restricted Accounts, which we will go over in a bit. You should apply for a trail equipment purchase project if you maintain significant miles of trails, meaning, are there enough miles of trails to justify a piece of equipment dedicated to only trails and trail facilities? You should also have the staff, volunteers, or club members with the skills necessary to operate the equipment. Finally, trails or trail facilities must be open to the public, even if for a fee. Generally, DCNR does not fund members-only clubs. Here are some things to consider before applying for a trail equipment grant. First, equipment can only be used for trails or trail facilities. For example, it cannot be used for maintenance and construction of other types of recreation facilities, public roads, or not publicly accessible properties. Second, the applicant must be prepared to maintain and care for the equipment long-term. Successful grantees must provide a status report to DCNR every 2 years after they have purchased the equipment, and DCNR permission is needed before any equipment can be sold or disposed of. Lastly, applicants should expect to use an open and competitive process to purchase any equipment. Here are a few common issues we see with trail equipment purchase applications. For grants that require match, it must be cash, and it must be secure when you apply for the grant. Non-cash match is not eligible for equipment purchase grants. Also, applicants must use realistic price quotes to establish grant requests. This will take a little bit of research on the part of the applicant to establish a realistic price for the type of equipment they'd like to purchase. We're going to take a moment here to talk about motorized recreation projects. DCNR does have dedicated funding sources for motorized recreation. Generally, those funds can pay for planning, land acquisition, design, development, rehabilitation, and maintenance, as well as equipment purchases for motorized recreation. There are two grant opportunities for motorized recreation. The first grant opportunity is called Motorized Trails. This is a federal source of funding that can pay for the development, rehabilitation, and maintenance of motorized trails, as well as for the purchase of equipment to maintain and construct those trails. This is our Pennsylvania Recreational Trails Program and is a federal source of funding. There is a 20% required match. Secondly, we have the ATV and snowmobile management restricted accounts. Those funds can only be used for projects that support ATVing or snowmobiling. These grants can pay for planning, land acquisition, design, development, rehabilitation, and maintenance, as well as equipment purchases. We have 2 grant rounds per year, and no matches required for those grants. Generally, to receive funding for motorized facilities, you will first need to have a written master plan in place, and this is something that DCNR can help fund. Now that we've gone through the various grant opportunities for trails, we're going to talk a little bit about accessibility requirements, which will help you scope your projects appropriately. Accessibility is an important element of any trail project, yet it is often misunderstood. When designing and developing a trail, it's important to remember that a trail is a public facility and must comply with the appropriate ADA and other accessibility standards. Understanding the appropriate standards will help develop a better application and cost estimate. To begin this discussion, we're going to start off with trails and the definition of trails when related to accessibility standards. And that definition is new or altered trails that are designed for hiker or pedestrian use and that connect either directly to a trailhead or to another trail. That is the definition for a trail when we're talking about accessibility standards. The standards for trails are covered in the Trails for All People manual, which is based on the federal guidelines for outdoor developed areas. You can get a copy of it on conservationtools.org or by doing an internet search for Trails for All People. The manual discusses requirements for trail surfaces, running slopes, cross slopes, signage, and potential exemptions to these requirements. While we will not cover the requirements for trails in this presentation, we do have an illustration here of a trail that is considered accessible. The surface is firm and stable, and the running slope is relatively low. At the bottom right is a photo of a sign posted at a trailhead for a hiking trail. You can tell from the sign that the hiking trail is relatively difficult and does not generally meet accessibility requirements. However, this sign was provided at the trailhead to let users know what they're going to encounter on the trail, and to then allow them to make their own decision on whether to proceed. This is something that would be covered and discussed in the Trails for All People manual. Next, we're going to discuss shared use paths. Shared use paths are multi-use paths designed primarily for use by bicyclists and pedestrians, including pedestrians with disabilities for transportation and recreation purposes. These paths typically have a machine-layered surface like asphalt or concrete or some other bonded material and are located in either an independent corridor or a public right-of-way. Trails that fall under the definition of a shared use path will follow the Public Rights-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines, which are now law under the ADA. These requirements must be met regardless of funding source. Before we move on, notice that we've only talked about pedestrian and hiking trails, and now bicycle and pedestrian trails. Trails that are specifically designed for uses like mountain biking, equestrian, or ATVs are not required to comply with the technical requirements that we just went over. In other words, there are no technical standards for those types of trails. However, outside of the design requirements for trails and shared use paths, we also have support facilities and features along most trails, and those features and facilities are generally covered under the 2010 ADA standards. Examples of facilities would be parking areas, restrooms, benches, etc. This slide helps to highlight the importance of understanding accessibility requirements when it comes to trail support facilities. Here is a photo of a parking area at a trailhead along a hiking trail. And here you can see that there is a concrete pad for the ADA parking area, a concrete aisle connecting to the restroom facilities, and the trail. The other photo shows a bench. Next to the bench, there is a paved area. These generally meet the 2010 ADA standards. The purpose of sharing these photos is to help illustrate how meeting accessibility standards can impact your overall scope of work and budget. Moving on from accessibility, we're going to wrap this up by going over our funding sources. Through our grant program, we have several funding sources for trail projects. Generally, DCNR decides on the most appropriate funding source for your project when we are reviewing your application. Number one is our Keystone Recreation Park and Conservation Fund, which is our primary source of funding. The Keystone Fund requires a 50-50 match, and only government entities are eligible, meaning municipalities, counties, and authorities. Eligible project types include development, planning, and land acquisition. This is the bulk of our funding. Next, we have the Environmental Stewardship Fund, which is very limited. It is also a 50-50 match, and it is one of the funding sources that we have available for nonprofit organizations, but municipalities are also eligible. This funding source can fund development, planning, and land acquisition. Next, we have the Pennsylvania Recreational Trails Fund, or what we call PRT, which is an 80-20 match, meaning 80% grant and 20% match. It is a federal source of funding, which means it comes with federal strings, so there are additional approvals and requirements during the life of the project. Most entities are eligible for this fund, and we can fund both non-motorized and motorized trail projects. This funding only accounts for about 15 to 20% of our total trail budget. Eligible project types include development, rehabilitation, and maintenance of trails and equipment purchases. Finally, we have our ATV and Snowmobile Fund. Funding comes from the ATV and snowmobile registrations. No match is required for this fund, and we have 2 grant rounds per year, one in the spring and one in the fall. Project types that are eligible are land acquisition, planning, development, rehabilitation, maintenance, equipment purchase, and educational programs. If you would like to review grant application documents, you can visit the DCNR grant portal and select more info in the grant opportunity you are interested in. As mentioned several times during this presentation, it is important to connect with your regional advisor as early as possible to discuss your project. Here we have a map and contact information for all our regional advisors across the state. This map can also be found on the DCNR Grants website. Thank you for listening to the Trails Breakout session, and good luck with your grant application.